Hello everyone and welcome back to another Strategoi video. This is only Jonas today because we're doing a rather short video on the places of power. Now if you don't know what a place of power is, hang it on tight because we're gonna talk all about it today. If you do know what it is and you're wondering why would we even make a video about this, well, I think if you're coming into the 4th edition with a 3rd edition mindset, you might actually underestimate the effectiveness of a place of power. Thus, Ryan and I felt it was interesting to make a video about this very topic. So let's dive right into it. So as a summary, just a quick overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to cover the rules for the places of power. You can find those in the General's Handbook or the core rules. Then we're going to look at the uses for a place of power in a magic scenario. We're going to do that the same for a prayer scenario. And then we'll finish off with a conclusion just to check out what things we really need to keep in mind when we're playing our next game with a place of power. So what is a place of power? A place of power is a terrain type. You would have an obstacle, for example, or a line of sight blocking terrain piece. A different type of that is a place of power. It has the place of power ability, which you can see here on the right. At the start of any turn, so that means both yours and your opponent's, you can activate a place of power with a hero. You pick a friendly hero within 3 inches, not wholly within, just within 3 inches of any place of power to use this ability. You roll a dice, that's a d6, and on a 1 you inflict d3 mortal damage on that hero. On a 2+, that hero gets one of those 2 abilities. If it's a wizard or a priest, you add 1 to their casting or chanting rolls, only for that turn. If your hero is not a wizard or a priest, you can use the unbind or banish manifestation ability as if that hero had wizard 1. Which is interesting because in the core rules, there's actually no other way to unbind or banish stuff if you're not able to do so from your war scrolls. So before in 3rd edition, you would have the heroic action to do that. Now you only have the place of power. Place of power terrain types also have the cover rule and also have the unstable rule, but that's a matter for a different video. Now, why would we make a video about this if it's just about a terrain type? Well, it's actually quite important in a lot of missions. There's only 3 out of the 12 GHB missions that don't use any places of power. 5 missions use 2 small pieces of place of power. So 1 in your opponent's zone and 1 in your own. And then 4 missions use a medium piece of place of power. So there's actually quite a lot of times where you will get to use these. The small pieces tend to be on the sides of the battlefield, while the medium pieces tend to be more towards the middle. And obviously from those medium pieces, you're going to get a lot more use, not only because it's larger and thus easier to be in range of with your 3 inches, but also because usually it's in the middle of the board where most of the action happens. So this is just a quick overview of what we're talking about today and why it's important to talk about it. Now, let's take a quick look then at how this would interact with magic and then with prayers. So for magic, we really need to look at the mathematical sides of casting your spells. You're still casting on 2d6 in 4th edition, so that's 2 dice. And all the casting values from all the generic faction spell lores go from a 5 to 8. I haven't checked the regiments of renown, and I also am not talking about war scroll spells, for example, because one example that I've put down here is Teclis has a war scroll spell with a value of 10, but that's not something from the Lumneth spell lore. So in just the army spell lores, all casting values vary from 5 to 8, and most of those spells are cast on a 6 or a 7. But the top number that you see is a 7. Most spell lores have spells that are cast on a 7. Well, what does that mean? If you look here on the right to the graph that we've used here from the darkfortress.co.uk, you can see that on average, if you're rolling 2d6 36 times, 6 times out of those 36 times, you're gonna get a 7. but obviously we're playing Age of Sigmar, so you would also be happy with an 8, a 9, a 10, an 11, or a 12 as a result on the die. So you can actually see that there's actually a much higher chance of you casting a spell than not casting a spell, because as you can see, 7 is the most common casting value, and rolling a 7 is the most common thing that you can do with 2d6s. And rolling higher than a 7 it actually increases your chances quite dramatically. So that's interesting to keep in mind. That is a obviously a little bit of common knowledge, I think, if you're a bit into wargaming. But the next slide is actually even more interesting. So you can obviously see here what the chances are of getting your result or a higher result than what you would need. For example, if you would need a 5+ to cast your spell, you're going to have an 83 or a 33% chance to cast that spell. So rounding off, 83% chances of casting that spell. A 7+ to cast is rounding off cast on an 58. So you can still see that only from casting value 8, the chances are slimmer of casting your spell than not casting your spell. So an 8+ to cast, Lumineth players know the pain here. For example, your Power of Hish spell, which Protection of Hish would give, which would give you a 5-up ward, is only cast on an 8+. You only have a 42% chance of getting that off without any bonuses. You can see it's actually quite a big difference, right? If you're wanting to cast a spell and its casting value is a 6, if you would be able to add +1 to that spell, for example, via Place of Power, you would actually increase your chance from 72% to 83%. So not only is it much easier to cast a spell with a +1, easier than you might think actually. You can see the percentage here and how much it varies. But it also becomes much harder for your opponent to unbind spells, because as you know, to unbind a spell you need 1 higher than the casting roll. So if you rolled a 7, your opponent needs to roll an 8. And as you can see, if you roll a 7, you had a 58% chance of rolling at 7. Your opponent only has 42% chances of rolling that 8-up. If you can imagine, then adding +1 from Place of Power actually makes it even harder for your opponent to unbind spells. And we're living in a world now where there are almost no unbind possibilities. So that actually makes +1 to your spells much more effective than you would think. Let's look at some more stats here. So this is what I was talking about. If you're rolling a 7, you have 58% chance of rolling at 7. Your opponent then has only 42% chance of unbinding that, which is 17% harder for him to unbind than it was for you to cast. If you add the +1 on top of that casting roll, you would actually be happy with your 6 to get your 7 casting value. So you'd have 72% chance of getting that cast off. And your opponent would actually be stuck with a successful unbind of an 8 still, and it would thus be 31% harder for him to unbind. Can you imagine? So that's actually quite a big number. It's almost a third harder, on average, to unbind a spell if you get that +1 to your casting value, and your opponent does not get a +1 to his unbind values. So that's interesting. A couple of examples here that I put down here below. So if you roll a 6, you cast your spell on a 6 without Place of Power. With a Place of Power, your opponent needs a 7+ to unbind. Thus, he has a 58% chance to unbind that. Pretty reliable, I would say, still. But with a Place of Power, things become much more dire. You roll a 6, but it's cast on a 7 because you get the +1. Then your opponent would still need an 8 to unbind that, which decreases his chance from 58 to 47, which is 14% harder to unbind that roll than it was in the previous scenario. And thus, about a third more difficult to unbind such a spell than it was for you to cast with that +1. So pretty rough and interesting if you keep that in mind, right? That with a +1, it's even harder to unbind than it would normally be. And I think that's something that we all obviously realize. It's super basic math, but I just wanted to show you the specific numbers here just to clarify how much more impactful it actually is to have that +1 unbind. And thus it is actually interesting to risk rolling that d6 and getting that +1. And it's also interesting to maybe deploy your hero close to a place of power from the get-go, just so you get that bonus. But we will get to the conclusion in the last slide here. Let's move on to prayers. Then prayers are a little bit harder for me to put into maths, because while it's only a d6, it actually stacks, so you can save your prayer value, sorry, your chanting value. So prayers in 4th edition are on 1d6. A priest can chant, and then he gets the d6 roll to his prayer pool, right? So if you roll a 2, you get 2 prayer points. The most common value that you would need for a prayer is 4. I've checked all the prayer lores for the faction packs, and the lowest number for prayers is a 3. Only the Daughters of Cain have a 3 value prayer, by the way. But all the other prayers are either 4 or a 5, and most of them are a 4. There is no way to deny prayers, which is kind of juicy, but then, there's statistically a higher chance of you failing that your prayer from the first go. So prayers of a 4+ have an equal chance of success or failure on their first roll. You have about 50% chance, I would say, to get that 4 or higher, which means that compared to spells, where your average is a 7 and the most common value is also a 7, you actually have a higher percent chance than 50% to get that 7. So spells are easier to get off, but there's a way to counteract them, whereas prayers have a harder time to reach that most common value, but there's no way to deny them. Obviously, chances greatly increase on subsequent rolls because, as I said, you save your value for your prayers. If we're adding a place of power to that, then things get a little bit more interesting. So once again, you see here the graph from the Dark Fortress. I put a 2+ to chant here because if you're a Daughters of Cain player and you need your prayer on a 3, with Places of Power, you actually have an 83% chance of getting a prayer off, which is, almost guaranteed, I guess. So it actually makes things much more, rewarding, and you can count on it more. Since the most common prayer value is a 4, being able to add +1 from a Place of Power and thus actually lowering your chanting value to a 3+ makes it 16,66% easier, or rounding off 17% easier for you to get your prayer off from the first roll, which is quite interesting, I guess. So pretty much what I just said. Keep in mind, guys, if you're building towards the bigger version of your prayer, some prayers have a way to spend more of their prayer points to increase its effectiveness. With a Place of Power, this is even more potent, right? Because you actually always get that +1. So if you also use your prayers with magical intervention, you're actually generating a lot more points that way. And over 3 hero phases, you almost have generated as much as a full extra prayer would give you on average. So that's interesting. So keep that in mind, that both for prayers and spells, this is actually quite impactful and useful to have that Place of Power nearby. So what can we conclude here? Using a Place of Power, well, you have a 17% chance of hurting yourself. That's the first thing that we have to keep in mind. So on a roll of a 1, you're gonna take D3 mortal damage. Obviously, if your hero is close to dying or you don't want to risk that, don't do it. But the upsides are definitely worth it for wizards and priests. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Place of Power, using a Place of Power is actually the only generic way from the core rules that you have to unbind or banish a spell or a manifestation if you have no wizards or priests or war scrolls that do something like that, right? So if you haven't brought any power leveled heroes, so no wizards or priests, or they've all been killed, and you really want to block your opponent's spell, or you want to banish his manifestation, move to that place of power, right? That's the only way you're gonna get there. And keep in mind, back in 3rd edition, you had magical, what was it called? The heroic action that allowed a non-wizard to unbind a spell. That was actually used quite often in my game, so I can imagine Place of Power also being useful for that in 4th edition. But if you're using a Place of Power, how are you going to use it best? So I really like to place my heroes within 3 inches during the deployment, especially if you've got a mobile hero that can later on move to a different part of the field. Usually with a smaller Place of Power, as I mentioned, they are placed on the sides of the boards, and thus my heroes always have to walk a long distance to get into the fray. But the upside is that if it's a board-wide spell, or a spell you just want to get off on a nearby unit, because they're usually on the sides with a Place of Power, it's also harder for your opponent to have a spellcaster nearby to be within 30 inches to unbind your spells. That's something to keep in mind. I like this especially on Elani and Elthor, for example, because they've got their teleport once they've killed a model, so there's usually a way for them to get back in range. But that's just one Lumineth example. If you've got a big base, it's also very easy, and if you've got a flying hero or something like that, you can just skip over the terrain anyway. It's also very important to keep in mind that it's one of the most easy ways to offset that -1 that you would get to casting and chanting when you're using Magical Intervention. I'd say Magical Intervention is probably one of my favorite command abilities so far. It is so strong. If you're running a priest, it's actually super valuable because it's basically a free hero phase to generate more of your prayer points to get to your higher values. And having that +1 really makes a big difference, right? Because otherwise you're generating D6 prayer points and you're already losing 1. So if you're rolling a 2, you're only generating 1 prayer point. That's kind of a feel bad, for example, for when you're spending a CP on that. So definitely worth it. Also keep in mind that if the most common value for casting a spell is 7, and that's lowered, your roll is lowered to a 6 because of the -1 from Magical Intervention, you're actually more inclined to fail your 7 up to cast than to succeed it. Whereas with the +1 from a Place of Power, you're balancing that out and you're back up again to 58% chance of at least getting that 7 up to cast off. So impactful, I would say, definitely for Magical Intervention, and I really like to use it as soon as I can. Now, do keep in mind, don't go out of your way and lose the battle with bad positioning just to use that Place of Power. But if you've been like me, my first game, where I really didn't fully grasp the impact of +1 to cast in a game where there's almost no unbind bonuses, and you've got a lot of ways to get -1 via Magical Intervention, for example. It's really a great tool to make your hero phase much more effective. Also in your opponent's hero phase, as I've just mentioned. So yeah, definitely try out the Place of Power, you guys. That's basically the conclusion, and that's what I could have said for the entire video, but I felt like it would be interesting to show the maths for you guys as well. So there you go, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's a little bit of a weird video, maybe a little bit shorter than usual. I've been so used to doing non-solo videos, either with Ryan or with other people now, that it's always a little bit more difficult for me to make these solo videos. But Ryan's been really busy, and I have been as well. I've been doing some work on the side. and I've only found the time now to do a video. So we really wanted to get something out to you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this sort of content, I know the mathematical videos are usually more Ryan's thing. I hope I still did it justice. We'll see what Ryan says in the comments about it. I hope he approves. If you guys also approve, please leave a like. It shows that you enjoy this type of content, and leave a comment saying what you think. If I made some mathematical errors, also leave that in the comments, and I'll pin it in a comment so everyone can check it out. If you want to talk about this or other topics, you can find us in the Discord, and obviously subscribe if you want to stay in touch. We're still on, on our regular schedule of at least one video a week. In the past couple of weeks, we've done 2 or 3 videos a week. That's probably going to be hard to keep up once my work and studies pick up fully again. But we're pumping out that content for you guys as much as we can. And if you want to see something else, you're always free to leave something in the comments as a request about what kind of videos you would like to see next. All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.